Well, speaking of gone, speaking of head coaches who may be gone, well, in this case, they're definitely gone. Dennis Allen, he has been fired as the head coach from the New Orleans Saints. It is potentially, something that, a lot of people thought might happen. Maybe a surprise it happened now in the middle of the season rather than later at the end of the season. However, we need to discuss who is the next head coach to be fired. Brian.
Doug Peterson, Jacksonville Jaguars. And it should have happened already. I have nothing against Doug Peterson personally, professionally. He is not good enough for the Jacksonville Jaguars. It ended very badly with him in Philadelphia. Shad Khan got this absolutely wrong at a critical time for the franchise where you got it wrong with Urban Meyer. You have Trevor Lawrence. You have a number 1 overall quarterback, a generational quarterback, and Trevor Lawrence has only gone backward. The Jaguars have only gone backward. The Jaguars going into the last season were Super Bowl contenders to a lot of the media and even their fan base. They cannot win a game right now. They're not good enough. They're not going forward. Doug Peterson should be gone already. But I tell you what, and we're going to get into this, it's going to be a long list this year. We've already seen 2 coaches fired midseason. That doesn't really happen in the NFL. There's a lot of teams that are underperforming, and it's more than ever. It's a cutthroat 24/7, 365 business run by billionaires. They want answers and accountability, and we just said this, the easiest way to do it is to fire a head coach.
Well, it's interesting in the case of Dennis Allen, actually, because there seemed to be some murmurings that the locker room wasn't very happy with how everything had been going. In fact, as well, former players had been discussing how they really didn't like Dennis Allen and the quarterback, in particular, Derek Carr. Like Michael Thomas. Can we take a look at what Michael Thomas tweeted? There we go. They fired all them coaches trying to cover his flaws up, still doing the same, insert bad word here. Fair to say, Michael Thomas, who was an integral part of the New Orleans Saints for years, for him to be so vocal, he's not scared of being vocal as well. That kind of says, in this situation, but in other situations as well, what is happening in the locker room. It's not all necessarily like, roses, is it?
Sunshine and rainbows.
That's the one, that's it. It's not though, is it? And, and it's important to look at as well. Like, we kind of think sometimes, well, everyone's going to be behind the head coach. It's not always the case.
No, it's not. And, I think within an organization, when you have a good organization, you do try and have those conversations inside as much as possible. You want to be united front. However, if we look at even how Dennis Allen ended up in this position, he took over from Sean Payton. And so it wasn't necessarily the method in which, just because you're a good defensive coordinator does not make you a great head coach. And you have to be a leader of people when you're in that head coach role. And I think really the firing of him, there were talks about it last year. People were surprised again that he kind of survived it. He looked great for those first 2 weeks when you bring in a new offensive coordinator, who really does a lot of nice things with Derek Carr. However, you lose 7 straight. First time you've lost 7 straight since 1999. And you just can't do that, especially when your last game loss is to the Carolina Panthers.
You can't lose to the Panthers.
I think that was a real nail in the coffin.
You saw Cam Jordan, who's considered a Saints legend now, basically saying, and he's quite a jovial guy, he's quite a funny guy, and he was basically just saying, guys, didn't think it would be this bad. We lost
to the Panthers.
He literally said that. He literally said it like that. And you know what? Really quickly as well. It's bizarre as well. It's bizarre. Dennis Allen fired mid-season. Not the first time this has happened. When he was head coach of the Oakland Raiders, who was his quarterback with the New Orleans Saints? Derek Carr. Who was his quarterback with the Oakland Raiders? Derek Carr. Yep. First time that has ever happened. And in fact, that loss to the Carolina Panthers means that if Derek Carr loses against the Las Vegas Raiders, he'll be the first NFL player, I think I'm correct in saying this, the first NFL player to lose to every single NFL team. That is not a stat you want. Okay, so Dennis Allen's gone. Doug Peterson, Jacksonville Jaguars is Brian's choice. We'll go through a few more, though. Phoebe, is anyone that pops to mind?
I don't know if they would fire him, and I love him. I love Brian Dable. He was my OC in Buffalo, but I think there's definitely a lot of tension right now. I mean, I was jokingly saying that stat earlier, but it's very real. The second touchdown that Daniel Jones has thrown at MetLife Stadium in over a year, since New Year's Eve of 23. I mean, you can't survive like that. And you come in as an offensive mind, you've worked with young quarterbacks before, you worked with Tom Brady, you've been in Alabama, you've been in some of the top places with top guys. And I think there's definitely pressure. He did sign a 5-year contract with the Giants, so what that actually looks like. And they did inherit, let's not be wrong about this, Joe Shane and himself did inherit Daniel Jones, but then you paid him. And so I think that's really where my struggle with it is. Davis is a great, smart guy. he sees what's happening on the field. He doesn't need us to tell him that Daniel Jones is not the guy, but you start to question, well, what is your long-term plan here? Because it doesn't feel like there is one. And that's hard when you're thinking you're wanting to be a part of this franchise and you still need a franchise quarterback.
Do you think it's more common that we're seeing head coaches getting fired mid-season, Phoebe?
I think it's happening now more. I think, the Premier League probably has a bit of influence on that as well, where we've seen, how many head coaches or general managers have been fired so far this year. I think but we're definitely living in an age of instant gratification, right? It's very rare that you have a Mike Tomlinson, the Steelers who've had 3 head coaches in the X amount of years. That is a big rarity. And I think it's so hard to keep that momentum and be positive when you're thinking, we got to win now. The whole thing with the NFL is a parity and you get the option to choose players.
What's the benefit though? What's the benefit though of it doing this, Brian? Because if you look at it from the Saints' point of view, right, they're essentially out of contention for the playoffs, right? You fire your head coach. It isn't like the Premier League in the sense that in the Premier League you can be like, and then we can look at Man United. Be like, hey, this player, let's get
and
this
you're doing the
manager from Man
Premier League
United.
because you don't want
do
to get relegated. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes
But you
down
can't
to.
just in the NFL. It's not as easy as just being like, hey, let's go and immediately hire our new head coach.
And normally, so when I was covering the NFL in America for a while, I and some of my colleagues did a study on this because I was covering the Houston Texans, and the Houston Texans at the time were one of the worst teams in the NFL. And there are people who have written about this before. If you go back and you start tracking the data and actually, put some science to this, it does not usually work for you. The teams that fire their coaches consistently do not magically turn into playoff contenders, Super Bowl contenders. They don't win the Super Bowl.
Look at the Panthers.
Yeah, you have to have consistency. You have to have top-down alignment. All these buzzwords, they are real. However, we are in a world now where it's the social media world. It is a fishbowl world. It is a media world. It's an instant gratification world. And these owners, look at Carolina and how they handled Frank Reich, and now they're a mess with Bryce Young. I also look at how it affects the quarterbacks. You look at Indianapolis and Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson, and now you promote Joe Flacco because Anthony Richardson taps out.
Is Shane Steichen another person that we can consider?
Shane Steichen could very well be gone after this year. I could go through a list. There's going to be about 8 or 9 guys that get fired this year, but it's this lack of uncertainty. What happens a lot is mid-season, these coaches know, because I've been in these buildings enough and dealt with these and have sources and talked to people and dealt with all the dysfunction before. And around mid-season, early season if you're in the New Orleans Saints, but around mid-season, you start hitting this point where coaches are coaching for their jobs and their future and their contract. And so they are playing players, they're promoting quarterbacks, they're benching quarterbacks, all not for the greater good of the organization and the build for 2 or 3 years down the road, so they can win right now and get 7 wins and show a little promise and keep their job for next year. And that's what you're having happen a lot in the NFL right now.
Let's talk about that actually really quickly in terms of Matt Eberflus and the Chicago Bears, because and I think I've mentioned this before. It sometimes seems a little bizarre that you've got your, brand new rookie quarterback, the future of your franchise. What is it, that phrase? The generational quarterback. I love that phrase. So you've got that person, and then who do you lump them with? Well, actually a head coach that may or may not be on the way out.
The fans don't love and could have gotten fired last offseason,
Yeah, so Matt Eberflus seems like a good example for that.
Yeah, and I want to throw out a name that we're not talking about right now that you continue to hear murmurings about. I don't believe it's fully his fault, because you have Tua Tagovailoa with the Miami Dolphins, and he's had all of his concussion issues. And I fully believe that if you're a well-run NFL organization, your depth chart, your roster, that is a GM's decision, unless you have a Bill Belichick and he has ultimate power. So Mike McDaniel is not in charge of the roster for the Miami Dolphins. However, that is his team. And you have Tua and you have all your concussion issues. He has to have a better answer at backup quarterback, and he hasn't for 2 years right now. And this is a team that you have Tyreek Hill, you have talent, you have an owner who has high expectations. Mike McDaniel, if this continues for the Miami Dolphins, I will not be surprised if he's gone. Look at Nick Sirianni he almost lost his job last year. It is an unforgiving, ruthless business. It's called NFL for a reason, not for long. And if you underperform, you are gone now. And there's going to be about 9 or 10 coaches that we get fired this year.